Alright, so let's see how this works first time showing a screen in the Screencast-O-Matic. But here we go. So I did do the section of professionalizing the news from the end of pages 172 until the rest of the chapter. So I will start it off here. So the first section I read about was the last layer of government control, and their whole issue, their whole viewpoint was direct censorship of news accounts and photos coming home from battlefields. Those were the battlefields in Europe, and the effort was too systematic and more effective than any previous efforts at battleship censorship of the U.S. military. So on to the next point. So it was in control of American soldiers heading back to foreign fields under the command of General John Blackjack Pershing. But with him, he had little regard to the press. So the whole thing with him and a fellow I'll mention in a second, Frederick Palmer, is they did not want any press conferences, well, few, if any, and no personal interviews. So they kind of did their thing with battleship censorship regimen, along with a war set pattern, for the next century and bear some scrutiny. And if these actions or wills weren't followed, then there'd be a $10,000 bond to ensure himself, as in Black, as the gentleman of the press. And lastly, correspondents then end up having to submit all the stories they wanted home. And those, I believe I mentioned in the next slide, have to do with if they were accurate enough or if they were well factual to be said to be sent home for submission. And yes, I do talk about that. So they were sent here to Military Intelligence Division to Army Signal Corps. So the Army Signal Corps would judge the photo files and decide whether or not they could be sent home, and honestly, not a lot of them got through. So this division was located at the AEF headquarters, as I mentioned there in the pictures there in the top right corner. That is Neufchâteau, France. If that's how you say it, that's in, yeah, northeastern France. And so the whole thing with this and photo files getting sent home is the editors often did not know what they were missing. Um, so they were kind of confused with their readers and them being left in the dark per se. So then censorship became a bedrock issue in the waging and covering of American wars. So a quote here: to give the devil his due, it must be acknowledged on the one hand that the military censor does some good. So that's where I'll get into that the censorship did do some good, some beneficial things. And examples of the information targeted for censorship that I include was the timing of troop movements, the codes for encrypting messages, and the like are obvious to any enemy, and most journalists do not hesitate to protect such secrets without even being asked. So that's how censorship could benefit, and it protects military secrets and doesn't want to reveal any information that could range from trivial, such as the troop socks, to the apocalyptic. So that could be developing of the first atomic bomb. Now we get into the harms of censorship. So even in wartime, censorship is readily abused by military officials, who might try to take advantage of it to mask defeats and or to make our armed forces appear more effective than they actually are. It's harmful also because it's used to protect incompetent officers from criticism, and that didn't go well because it's a practice that can lengthen wars or even lead to defeat. Always involves an effort to bamboozle the public, so the public is always left to dry or left in bad situations, and they're always the ones that need to get the news like this. And the problems are especially in wartime because it has to do with generals who are right or wrong, troops or allies that won't fight, equipment in any way, and censorship is really blatant for keeping open secrets of the war itself. So next we have supporting the war effort. So this was kind of the beginning of Creel and his efforts to shape newspaper coverage. Excuse me, and uh, it cooperated when in doubt. Most editors engaged in self-censorship, but the president and Congress didn't want to take any chances. So this is where the Sedition Act of 1918 comes in, and it began as a set of amendments to the Espionage Act of 1917. So, in addition to the earlier bans on publishing false statements that might hurt the U.S. Armed Forces or aid the enemy, and on interfering with a draft, the new law made it a crime to publish any disloyal, profane, or abusive language about the form of the government of the U.S., publish any language intended to bring the form of the government or the Constitution uh, to disrepute, or willfully display the flag of any foreign enemy, or willfully urge, incite, or advocate the country, which what is necessary or essential to the prosecution of the war. So yeah, the point was to continue protecting U.S. armed forces. So that's where we get into this first situation with Eugene Debs. So he was known to be a prominent leader in America, a socialist leader, I should say. Um, he brought up a quote about dark irony of a nation fighting for freedom abroad while suppressing freedom at home. And so from there, he was charged with sedition because at his federal court in Cleveland, Ohio, Debs did not dispute the facts. He had given that speech in Canton, Ohio, and he had no intention of denying it. So, though he had a good quote about self-governing people being free, institutions are democratic, uh, he still got charged, and they saw it as dangerous. But for Debs, his social approach to get out didn't work because, yeah, like I said, they still found it abusive and what he was trying to do. So he's one of the first guys charged with this sedition, and he was hardly the only war critic, but clearly the most prominent, being one of the first. So the first major case to reach the High Court, and this was Schneck. How do you pronounce that? Yeah, Schenck versus the United States. So Schenck is a leader in the Socialist Party and attacked the wartime draft. So his appeal reached the Supreme Court, and it was the first significant attempt to interpret the First Amendment. And him as well, being a part of the Socialist Party, they all kind of stuck together in these situations. Um, so according to the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Schneck was guilty of inciting his readers to action. In upholding the convention, Holmes began by dismissing some relatively minor matters, established his argument by imputing a motive to Schenck. Yeah, sorry, I keep butchering that. But Schenck still urged readers to change the law, not break it. He didn't want to get rid of the First Amendment, but did want to change some issues that he found with it. But yeah, it didn't really work out for him as he was sentenced to jail. So the second major wartime First Amendment case, this had to do with Deb's appeal of his conviction in the Ohio case. Uh, it was decided by the Supreme Court and involved Deb's appeal of conviction. Holmes again was the one writing the opinion. The court unanimously rejected the argument that the socialist leader's speech was protected by the First Amendment and upheld Deb's conviction as well. The speech itself for Debs did not pose a clear and present danger, but the jury said differently. And like Schenck, Debs did not urge anyone to do anything illegal, though they still didn't see that as the case. And it's kind of the funniest thing I read is that he still entered the 1920 campaign for president in a prison cell, and he actually won nearly 1 million votes, believe it or not. So the third major First Amendment case was growing out of the Great War, and this was Abrams versus the U.S. Involved a political pamphlet which just was distributed in New York, and that as well presented a clear and present danger. Um, yeah, sorry, I was spaced. So yeah, and this was on March 23rd, 1918. The pamphlets mocked Wilson and charged that the president had ordered an invasion of Russia, not for a stated reason, to open an eastern front against Germany. So yeah, this was an enemy of the workers, and the whole thing was that it was against capitalism, and it specifically denied that any sympathy for Germany and its culture of militarism. So the pamphlet further claimed that war bonds brought by American workers were going to be used to buy bullets to kill not only German soldiers but also the Russian workers. So this aimed at resisting the undeclared war in Russia, not even in Germany, and violated the Espionage Act as well as the Sedition Act. And lastly, there's one bright moment in, I said gloom winter because I wanted the slide to look better, but it's gloomy winter. And this was on December 13th, 1920, where Congress repealed the Sedition Act of 1918 while leaving intact the older provisions that made up the Espionage Act, and that law was left on the books. In the end, the campaign against the press turned into a rout. There was too much combined power that overwhelmed the American press that went from the president to the Supreme Courts to Congress, and publications from ethnic communities where loyalty was questioned, but in the end, loyalty won over the independents, and the socialist press was also suppressed. Pretty much everybody in those courts of the three cases had to do with socialism, and it was all overwhelming. But yeah, at the end of the day, loyalty won over independence, and the chapter ends with it would be more than 5 decades before the press felt powerful and independent enough to challenge the national government directly. Thank you for coming through with this talk. I will pause it and see where I'm at, 11 minutes. I hope you learned something, whoever does read this, and that's all the information I got. Thanks for listening.